All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Pavlos Protobabas. I'm the scientific director for the Institute for Applied Computational Science, and I usually introduce the speaker and give announcements for the seminars. I'll do the same today. So the seminar series, for people that don't know, touches topics on computational or data science. We cover a lot of different topics and very diverse topics, I would say. So just next week, for example, we have Dean Wade from Activision, which is one of these companies. They do games. I don't know how many of you do games. He's going to be talking about data science in game creation. I think that would be cool. Today I'm introducing the speaker. It's one of our closest MIT affiliate. She's almost like a family. Is Zoya Bylinskii. So Zoya just finished her PhD at MIT, but while she was doing her PhD, she advised a number of our students. She's been close to us, and for the first time, we're going to hear her talk today, so I'm very, very excited to hear about that. So her research is basically looking at how AI helps us with vision, computer vision. She has a lot of cool applications, so I won't go through them, so I'll let her talk. Coincidentally, now that she graduated, she had a baby a few months ago, and also she's at Adobe, who is working there in the research lab. So help me welcome Zoya.
Thank you. So I think you can hear me at the back? Okay. Just to get a sense, how many of the audience are actually IACS students? IACS? Okay. Okay, great. That's just for my information. I'm very excited to tell you about this research because it's an interdisciplinary topic and it branches human vision and computer vision with applications to user interfaces and graphic designs. And the reason I asked how many of you are students is because I really hope that through this talk, maybe I'll inspire some of you to pursue more interdisciplinary research directions as well. And Pavlos had asked me to say a few words about kind of how I got to Adobe. My academic journey so far has been an undergrad at the University of Toronto. I did computer science and stats. Then I moved to MIT for my master's and PhD. Just graduated this past summer and was looking for local postdoc opportunities, but this really nice Adobe offer came up. And so far, at least, it's going to have the same freedoms as an academic position. So I'm in charge of supervising students, getting interns, doing good research, publishing, and once in a while converting some of that research into product. But for the most part, it's very much an academic position. So after my talk, if you're interested in talking to me more about industry versus academia, or specifically what Adobe does in the area of AI, I'm happy to answer those questions. Okay, let's get on with the talk. So throughout the talk, I want you to have this picture in mind. So my research really aims to understand the human brain through perception and cognition experiments in order to understand what makes visual content effective. And we can then use that effective content to, say, educate or communicate more effectively back to the same human brain and kind of close the loop. So throughout my experiments, my studies, we run a lot of user testing, both to study the brain and also test how it interacts with our stimuli. And kind of in the bottom right-hand corner, you will see once in a while this pop-up with links to data sets and code. And this is for the students out there who might be interested in playing with some of this data. This is perception data, so eye movements, memory, et cetera. So if you want this for your research projects or you just want to explore this space, watch out for this bottom right-hand corner. Okay, and I should start the talk by thanking all the people that have contributed to my academic journey throughout my time at MIT, various advisors and collaborators, and my Adobe mentors during my internship at Adobe, and they're now my collaborators as well, and Harvard collaborators in the visualization and HCI groups that I've been privileged to work with since the beginning of my PhD. So I've been around here throughout my whole PhD. Okay, here's another picture I want you to have in your heads throughout my talk, because this is a typical image processing pipeline, and I'm going to be borrowing various elements of it throughout my talk. So a typical image processing pipeline, so this is a computer vision task, operates on images as follows. It takes images as input. It extracts some low-level features, usually edges. It combines them in various ways to build up mid-level representations. And those mid-level representations come at different levels. So combining the edges, you can get junctions, and then object parts and objects. And eventually, you use that information to solve some kind of prediction task. In this case, to predict the scene category. And there's numerous applications to solving this image prediction task, which is why people are so excited about computer vision, and there's so many people working in this field. And image search is one application you're most familiar with, probably. But in general, if we can tag images and categorize them, then we can store them and retrieve them very efficiently. And then there's the side tasks like search and surveillance, so to find images or frames in videos that are unusual, or to annotate for the visually impaired. So there's tons of applications. I'm not even covering the tip of the iceberg here, but this is why it's very exciting to solve these image processing tasks. And as a lot of you are probably also familiar with, a lot of this image processing pipeline has been replaced by neural networks in the past few years, leading to huge gains in performance at solving these tasks. And neural networks tend to work end-to-end, so they take as input the image pixels directly, they do the feature processing through the pipeline, and they spit out the prediction at the other end. So along the way, it's various filters and nonlinear operations that built up this prediction. And I'm going to use deep neural networks throughout my talk, but only as a tool. So you'll see where I find the features that they extract to be useful for my applications. But the other picture I want you to have in mind is that of a human brain, because the human brain is actually the best computational system we have so far for solving the prediction problem very robustly and generalizably. So the human brain can see through noise and perturbations in the data to make accurate predictions, for instance, of the scene category. And we're inspired by the human brain because it is able to solve these problems by building up meaningful intermediate mid-level representations. And so when I talk to you about the perception and cognition experiments that we run, we're going to try to infer what kind of mid-level representations the brain is extracting in order to inspire computational algorithms. But of course, a side interest is also to understand the human brain more fully. And the main task that I will focus in this presentation that we run, and the high-level task that we give the human brain, is that of memory. So we ask the human brain to memorize images, and then we can try and infer from which images are memorable and which are forgettable, what image components lead to us remembering those images. That gives us some hints of a mid-level representation that the brain might be forming. But more directly, we can measure this representation by looking at people's eye movements. So you're also going to see a lot of eye tracking experiments throughout the slides I'm going to present to you, whereby we use where people look to infer what information they're encoding into memory. Okay, so that means that this kind of overview of the talk that I'm going to present to you today is going to cover these three main experimental paradigms for studying human perception and cognition. What makes images memorable? What do people attend to in images that we can measure from their eye movements? And what do they choose to actively explore? And I'm going to show you a cursor methodology for that as well. And the way that I've structured my talk, I'm going to first show you how some of these paradigms apply to natural images, because that's the more standard space for image processing to operate in, and actually the space in which I started when I started my PhD. And then we're going to see how those techniques and those findings transfer to graphic designs and visualizations, the non-natural image domain. And just for clarity, you're going to see a lot of heat maps throughout my presentation. So just to make sure we're on the same page, high values in the heat map indicate that we expect a lot of people to look, attend, or click on those regions of the image. So these heat maps that I will show you are aggregated over a population of participants. And I'm going to refer to them in various ways: attention maps, fixation maps, if it's eye movements, click maps, importance maps. Okay, so let's start with memory and how we investigate image memorability, what makes an image memorable. And what we find is that the best way to explain to you how the experiment works is by making you our participants. So I'm going to show you a sample of this game that we crowdsourced. You're going to be the same kind of participant that we would have online. And hopefully you'll play along with me. You're going to see a sequence of images roll by. They're going to roll by very quickly. Anytime an image repeats in the sequence, I'm going to ask you to clap your hands to indicate that you remember seeing it in the sequence. Okay? Because it happens really fast, please prepare your hands. Ready? Go. Good. No. Good. You're awake. No. Good. Okay. So hopefully you saw what this game looks like, and you notice the consistency across you, which is interesting, and I'll go back to this point. But these are the kinds of games that we would scale up. We'd run them on Amazon's Mechanical Turk among thousands of images and hundreds of participants. And the way we use the participants is to compute memorability scores for the images. This is why it's called memorability. And this game was first kind of thought up, and this memorability notion was first defined in the Aude Oliva lab at MIT by my colleague Philip Isola, who was a grad student at the same time as me, but is now a professor in C-Cell at MIT. So you can go chat with him and congratulate him for this game. But he defined memorability in the following way. It's the percent of people that remember correctly seeing that image from before. So it's the percent of people that would have clapped correctly. There's also false alarm rates, and there's deep prime measures that we could compute. But for now, I'm going to brush them all aside. We're just going to focus on hit rate. And hit rate is going to serve as our score for images. Now, as you've noticed probably, a lot of you were consistent. You were consistent in which images you remembered, and you were even consistent in which images you misremembered, you false alarmed on, maybe forgot. And what Philip had found originally was that there's huge consistency across people online, on Mechanical Turk, from all over the world, in playing these games. And the way consistency was measured was taking the whole population, splitting it into two groups, ranking the images by the memorability scores of both groups, and rank correlating. Now, Spearman's rank correlation varies from -1 to 1, so this is very high. This is telling us that people are very consistent. And this is across different splits and groups of people. Now, what does it mean that people are very consistent? Well, it means that this notion of memorability can be abstracted away. We can factor the observer out of the equation and assume that we can predict it from the image pixels alone. Since people are consistent, this is a computable notion. And yes, we've built models that can take images as input and predict the memorability of those images later. And we've done this using low-level features and using neural networks. But the high-level takeaways, if you want to make an image memorable, is that what we tend to remember is images with people, close-up objects, animals, and as we descend down the memorability towards the more forgettable images, we start seeing indoor scenes, maybe then hallways, then city scenes, and the most forgettable images are landscapes, even beautiful ones. So aesthetics, interestingly, is not correlated with memorability at all. Now, we wanted to test whether this consistency across people is not just a function of certain image categories ending up at the top and others at the bottom, that being a very simple prediction problem. We wanted to see if this consistency across people, this notion that some images are inherently more memorable, holds across different image collections. So since Philip, we've run a lot of follow-up studies and on different image types, including faces and visualizations, as I will show you in the second part part of the talk. But one of the first studies that I ran was investigating this notion at the fine-grained scene category level. So for 26 different scene categories, I reran this experiment where people in the experiment would only ever see images of that category. So they would only be exposed to, say, amusement park images or house images or cockpit images. And they played this game for us. And what we saw is that the consistency we saw across the general image set holds individually for every single one of these categories. So we were able to replicate this 26 times and show that for any image category, we can discover the images that are most and least memorable. So what you can see on this slide is 4 of the top images. They're the most memorable images of these 4 categories, and then the 4 most forgettable. Now, if you look really carefully, you might start to see some patterns. And the patterns that you might see is that the more memorable images tend to come from maybe unusual vantage points, or have unusual color schemes, or have objects really close up. And we had this intuition as well. And so to quantify it, we turned to information theory and just used a very simple model. Our hypothesis was that an image that is most distinct from its collection, where the collection might be the sequence of images you see in an experiment, if that image stands out in some feature space, we predict it's going to be more memorable. And so the exact way we compute it is we use a neural network. We run the image through the neural network that was originally trained to predict scene category, but we don't care about the scene category. We care about the mid-level representation that the neural network used. Because it turns out that the mid-level representation for predicting scene categories contains a lot of information about objects in the images. And those objects help to classify how unusual they are in one image versus the collection. And so when we have all the images in a context, in a collection, we can compute their feature vectors. We can then compute the feature vector of any given image in that collection or a new image and measure its distinctiveness with respect to that collection. This is just the negative log likelihood under this distribution. We use mixture of Gaussians. It was easy to model that way. And it turns out that this model is quite predictive of memorability. So this tells us that context does matter. And it's like the white black sheep phenomena, right? If something really stands out, you're going to remember it. But if now it's a black sheep among black sheep, you're not going to remember it as well. And we make those predictions using our model and correctly predict that the images in the top left, they're all images of bridges. Now, if you were in an experiment where you only saw bridge images, those would actually be the most memorable images. Now, if you squint, you'll realize that the bridge is actually quite hard to see in this scene because they look like other scene categories. They look like water sources or fields or bluffs, and that's precisely why they were memorable across other bridges. But the moment you combine those bridge images with other scene categories, so you have the context of a lot of different scenes, those images now fall to the bottom because they're now colliding in your memory with those other scene categories. And the most memorable bridges are going to be ones that can't be confused with any other scene categories, but are also very different from all the other bridges. So if you wanted to make an image stand out, you have this complex problem to solve. It can't collide with other images in the category. The other part of this experiment was to show that for the different experiments, so each experiment, each of the 26 categories is a point here, and along the x-axis we see the entropy of a category. So the entropy is just the average distinctiveness value. So we're really measuring how jointly distinct the images in a collection are, how different they are from each other. And hit rate, which is memorability of that category, the average memorability of all the images is on the y-axis. So you see this nice trend that as you increase the entropy of the category or the context, you also increase the average memorability of the images, which translates to the number of images people are able to remember in a sitting. And this is interesting because this says that even though people saw the same number of images, we're able to pack more into their memory if we make the images distinct enough. So of course, this has a lot of applications for image processing, for image curation, for how to collect a set of images, how to make them jointly maybe more memorable, how to pick the best images out of your photo album, how to curate maybe presentations even if you want to go that far, to make certain elements stand out more than others because those images and those slides are more distinct from the collection. And all the applications that we can build on top of it, a lot of them are still kind of open and out there to try. So if you're interested in playing with some of those applications, let me know. Okay, but so far, I've told you that we've factored the observer out of the equation completely. So we're really predicting just crowd-based memorability scores. But what if we want to take the individual observer into account and make individualized predictions? Can we, for instance, say that Jane either remembers or forgets a particular image? So here the question is posed as such: if I show the image to Jane the second time, can I reliably predict whether she will remember the image? And as you can see from the icon in the right, as a hint, we will be using some signature of Jane's eyes in order to do that. So what we found was that when people were shown images from the most forgettable category, we saw that their pupils started to dilate. And the pupil dilation follows the memorability categories. And this is actually supported by the cognitive science literature that tells us that pupils dilate more when there's more cognitive effort required. So this is telling us that when people are looking at these images the second time they're seeing them, if their pupils dilate, they're really having a hard time retrieve them from memory. So this was a very cool finding and a statistically significant one. Unfortunately, the absolute effect is small enough that it's not quite practical at this stage for applications, so something you would use on a cell phone, because the lights around you in the environment would impact your pupil dilations even more. So in an experimental setting, it's interesting, but if we want to build this into an application, we need to do something else. And in order to do that something else, we're going to change the question up a little bit. And now we're going to ask, the first time I show Jane that image, from her eye movements then, can I predict whether or not she's going to remember the image later on? And turns out that we can, and this is a much larger effect. So now we're not just looking at the small micropupil dilations, we're looking at her full eye movements on the image. And this is something we run in the lab. We didn't crowdsource this part of the experiment. We did this with an eye tracker. We want to be able to look at her eye movements on an image. So this is just eye movements, but convolved with Gaussian, so they form distributions. And from them, we want to say, will she remember that image if she looks at the image like that on the left, or if she looks at the image like that on the right? So we constructed a model that would predict whether or not a user would remember an image by building an exemplar classifier that separates eye movements made by participants on this image versus eye movements made by participants on all other images in the collection. Because the idea is, if Jane's eye movements look like they came from this image, like they were elicited by that image, we're going to predict that she remembers the image. But if her eye movements are not distinctive to this image, we're going to predict that she's going to forget the image. And so to give you some intuition of why that is, what's distinctive to an image occurs in some region of the image. And if you don't pay attention to what's distinctive to that image, you're likely that image is going to collide in memory with others. So for instance, if I show you all road images and you look in some general direction and you look at them all the same way, chances are a lot of them you'll forget, they'll collide in memory. But if you look at what makes those road images distinctive, maybe a road sign, and the road signs are going to be in different places on different road images, then I'm going to predict you're going to remember it. So here's some example predictions from our model. You can see 3 images. And I'm showing you along the rows, it's 6 different users who looked at, 6 different participants who looked at that image. And in the middle, our model automatically predicts that those people will remember the images. And in the right panel, our model automatically predicts that those people will forget those images. And in 9 out of the 10 cases that I show you here in both panels, our model gets it right. Okay, but let's look quantitatively at how well this model does. So let's compare it first to our crowdsourced predictor. So the crowdsourced predictor is just using the crowd memorability score as a prediction of whether or not a person will remember that image later on. And the crowd is at 60% accuracy at predicting whether an individual will remember an image or not. And that comes from the consistency between people. Now, what happens if we start selecting the more difficult to predict images? Those are images that are neither consistently memorable or forgettable. We enter this territory where naturally we're at chance predicting whether or not an image is going to be memorable, because there, where a person looks or how a person interacts with an image determines whether they fall on the memorable or forgettable side of the spectrum. But the eye movements, they remain relatively stable across all the image types. So from the eye movements, we can determine whether or not a person's going to remember that image at 66% accuracy. And this is for all image types. So these are accuracy rates that already are quite reasonable to build into applications. But this project was also pre-neural networks. So I'm sure that if we go back to this now, we can push this number even higher. Okay, so hopefully with that, I've convinced you that eye movements can give us some interesting cues, interesting clues into what happens inside the brain and how attention is linked to memory. So in general, eye movements and attention has been a very interesting topic for me. So I've also studied it during my PhD, and I've been wondering how well do the computational models predict human attention at this point? Because if computational models can predict human attention very well, then we can use them for really cool applications without having to track people's eye movements in the lab with an eye tracker. So that was how I started my journey into the computational attention literature. And I started what is now the largest saliency benchmark to date. So saliency is just another word for computational attention. To date, we have more than 80 model submissions. So this is a score chart. And I've looked at how these computational models of saliency evolve over time. So at the beginning, when this benchmark was just starting out, I think this was around 2012, a lot of models were performing similarly and could solve simple cases like find defects or spot a bright patch amidst the texture background. They correctly predicted that people look there, but those cases were not very interesting. Rather, we wanted to see if they behave like humans on very natural and complex images that have clutter, that have people, that have many objects. And what we saw back then when the benchmark started was that they were very far away from human attention. So what you can see here is 3 sample images from our benchmark and the ground truth human fixations. Humans are very consistent where they look, but models were kind of all over the place and were not good predictors of humans on this task. Now, I left this middle region blank, and you can probably expect what's going to be there, what kind of models have contributed to the best improvements in performance, and let me explain why that is and what's happening. So large-scale computational models of attention have also benefited from these models that have been trained to predict on completely different tasks. So neural networks that have been trained to predict scene category or objects, they have been repurposed for predicting people's attention by just fine-tuning, rather just retraining the last few layers of the network while keeping the low and mid-level features fixed the same. And the reason why this works is because those mid-level features for scene classification, they tend to contain a lot of information about objects. And objects are exactly what drives people's attention in these natural images. So what we see in these last few years is that computational models have really started to converge on human attention and start to accurately predict it. Now, I eliminated a lot of slides from this presentation because of time to show you where they're still failing, and there's really interesting cases. And I'm going to kind of leave it at that, and you can ask me about it later. But I do want to go back to this original question that we started with, was, is it interesting to predict people's attention on natural images? And a lot of people in the community have argued that this usual task we give people when we capture their attention on natural images is very fabricated, very kind of lab-based. Usually we give them a task like, please look anywhere you want to look on this image. Okay, maybe people are consistent. What are they doing exactly? Maybe they have some internal tasks. So there's a lot of debate in the community as to whether this task is meaningful and whether or not we should just maybe model the end goal of our saliency models. If we want to detect objects, let's just detect objects. But I am interested in the question of attention, but maybe not in this task-free variant. So in order to turn towards tasks, we're actually now going to step away from the natural images and go towards the artificial non-natural image domain of graphic designs and visualizations, where we're going to come back to this notion of attention again and maybe have a little bit more meaning there. So we're going to open this door to graphic designs. And this door actually has been not open too much before this, because people in computer vision and human vision tend to focus on natural images, while researchers who work on graphic designs and visualizations tend not to use as many of the computer vision and human perception tools. So this is ripe territory for new discoveries and interesting questions that we can ask. So we started out venturing into the space of visualizations with our Harvard collaborators in Hans-Peter Pfister's group. And we just wanted to ask, to begin with, going back to the memory question, do the findings that we have on natural images, do they still apply for visualizations? Are we going to have the same kind of consistency? And if so, what is it that makes some visualization images more memorable than others? So we ran the same large-scale experiments that we did before with the natural images, and we did it both at short exposure times, like what you saw, and at longer exposure times to give people time to read and actually inspect the data that they were shown. There we go. And one thing we found right away is that, again, we get huge human consistency in terms of which images are memorable and which are forgettable. This time, they're visualizations. So this means that with the visualizations as well as the natural images, we could do something by just analyzing the image pixels alone. So let's take a look at the three amongst the top memorable visualizations. What you can see is that they're also the distinct visualizations. Now, what do I mean by distinct in this case? Well, it's a distinct visual encoding. So maybe it's not a standard bar graph, but a bar graph composed of coins. Maybe you have pictographs along the way. Distinct could also refer to the text, which is interesting. And so if the visual is not distinct, but the text, the title is unusual, or is using very specific terminology, not just an arbitrary graph about the economy versus time, but you come up with an interesting title, that will also serve to trigger people's memory and make that visualization more memorable at longer time scales. So we see this notion of distinctness again. Now, to measure it more fully, what's happening and what mid-level representations people are using, or exactly what they're encoding or retrieving from memory, we again turn to eye tracking. So we ran eye tracking experiments on these visualizations. We capture where people look when they're encoding the visualizations into memory, so the first time they see it. We're capturing their eye movements when we show them the visualizations again during a subsequent memory task. So this way, we want to see where they look in order to retrieve the visualization from memory. What's triggering their memory? And then in the last phase, we ask them to pull out descriptions from memory when we show them blurred versions of the visualizations. So at this point, we just want to see what details they're actually able to extract, not just whether they can remember the image. OK, so let's take a look at what some of those eye movements look like. So I'm showing you a memorable image category, a less memorable image category. And I'm showing you the eye movements plotted on top. So you can see nice exploration patterns. And you can see that the most memorable images kind of have this visual encoding that's more memorable. Now I'm showing you what happens at recognition time, and this is where we see a big difference in the eye movement patterns. So in both cases, people had the same amount of time to look at the images in order to tell us whether or not they remember them. But in the left-hand side, for the most memorable images, they didn't really look around at all. They knew at a glance that they had seen those images before because the visual encoding was unique enough. And on the right-hand side, you see them re-exploring the images again. Now, if you look kind of more in depth on an image-by-image basis, you see what the people do is they'll start in the center. Maybe they recognize they don't remember it visually. They'll go to the title. If the title is distinct, they'll stop. If it's not, they keep looking for an element that can serve as an anchor or a hook into memory. And what you might tell me now, you kind of looked at these images, okay, well, the visually recognizable ones, sure, they look nice, but are people going to remember more about them? And we were interested by this question as well. And this is where the third aspect of our task came in, where we asked people to elicit descriptions from memory. So we hand-coded all those descriptions to see how many things they got wrong, how many details they got correct, etc. And what we see is that for the visually most memorable visualizations, people also tend to recall more details from memory and make less memory mistakes. So if something jogs your visual memory, you'll also associate more content with it. Now, to give you a little bit of insight as to why that might be the case, here's a toy example where we have a bar graph on the left and the same bar graph on the right annotated with pictographs or icons. And if I showed you the bar graph on the left, you might misremember the exact country names you saw corresponding to the bars. The moment I put flags there, they serve as additional visual hooks into memory that will jog your memory and help you make less of those memory mistakes. So they're serving as another kind of encoding. And when you remember things visually, you pull out more details. Okay, now motivated by some of these findings, there have now been a number of applications in industry. This is a Microsoft tool to help designers create more memorable or effective visualizations to kind of at a glance capture people's attention and transmit very quickly. This isn't meant for specialists that would look at regular graphs. This is meant for really the common folk at a glance to show them some piece of data and have them remember or understand it very quickly. Okay, but so far, all these experiments have been done in the lab with an eye tracker. Now, that might make you wonder, okay, but how scalable is it? Can we make conclusions about a larger population of people? And more interestingly, since this is a computational talk, can we collect data at such a scale that we can learn to build computational models off of attention? Well, this leads us to this last part of the talk, where I'm going to show you how we can use the cursor as a proxy for attention. And specifically, we came up with an interface that looks like this. And at the same time as us, there have been other similar works out there. Maybe you've seen them. But the idea is that this models kind of our foveal vision with periphery. So participants go and see this blurred visualization or image. They click on regions they find interesting and important in order to describe the visualization. So one key point of this interface is now we have a task for people. We're not just saying look anywhere you want to look. We're saying we need you to understand what's going on here. So click anywhere you need to in order to understand what's going on here and write to us a description of what you saw. So now we have this nice link between where people want to look and what information they need in order to understand what's going on. And this is now something we can run at scale on Amazon's Mechanical Turk and convert these clicks into click maps. And we call these importance maps because it's now the important regions that people are attending to. And we ran this with, we ran a giant study. I think we had something like 30 or 40 different experiments with different parameter permutations. We really wanted to get right how you fit the task, the image type, the blur, and the size of the fovea in order to model human attention best. And in particular, one thing we found is that for visualizations with a description task in a given range of parameters, we can explain using clicks up to 90, not up to, but actually 90% of human fixations. So we can, for all feasible computational applications, replace eye movements with these clicks given this task methodology. Okay, and now that we have things at scale, we can now use them to train a computational model. So we're borrowing the same ideas since these deep neural network models of attention were the best ones for natural images. We use the same kinds of models for these non-natural images, for visualizations and graphic designs. But now, instead of using the networks that are trained to predict scene category, we picked a type of network that's more appropriate for our task. Because we're working with graphic designs that have isolated elements, we decided to use, to repurpose network that for natural images predict segmentations. And you'll see why that is the case a bit later, but really it's because the graphic design applications we want to build on top of those predictions will benefit from having nicely isolated elements as well. So we take a network trained for segmentation, we fine-tune, we just retrain the last few layers because we do want to reuse a lot of the low and mid-level features that have learned about objects and segments in images, and we just retrain it to predict attention, in this case, click attention or importance. And we find just with, as in the segmentation literature, that adding back some features from the lower level of the network helps to isolate the design elements a little bit more. So this is somewhat of an architectural detail, but might be interesting to some of you. Okay, and what we did just as a sanity check was we evaluated our model against natural image saliency models to see that, in fact, this domain gap exists and the natural image saliency models can't predict attention on these non-natural images as well as we could by having this specialized domain. And we find that to be the case. But now let's get to some of the interesting stuff that we can do with the importance annotations. And I'm just going to spend the last few minutes of the talk at a high level going over some of the applications that we ran on top of the importance predictions. Now, importantly, we run all these applications with importance as kind of a baseline representation. We're not polishing any of these applications. So if polished, they'd look better, but we just want to show that just importance alone can do the job. So here's one such application. We want to retarget graphic designs. Now, retargeting just means you take as input a design, say, of a poster, and then you want to redesign it given new constraints. For instance, to be a website banner or a business card. And so we just propose a very simple approach. Using our importance annotations, we automatically predict importance on these graphic designs, and we crop around, we find the region with the highest importance and propose it as a banner to represent that poster. And here's some more examples you can see. Now, we never annotated, this is the title or this is the text or these are images. Our network learns what is the most relevant content, and it learns to localize the title no matter where it is in the poster, knows that that's a very key element. If the title's not there, it learns to combine visual and textual regions to represent those images in a summary. And a very similar approach, but for a somewhat different application, is to compute thumbnails automatically. So in this case, we take a visualization as input, and we want to create a square thumbnail. Now, this thumbnail, it's not intended to replace the original visualization. It's just an entry point to the visualization. So it could be the icon on your desktop to access that visualization, or it could be an icon in a large data set of visualizations that you would need to look through. So the way we tackle this problem is, again, we just use predicted importance out of the box. This gets computed automatically. We find multiple regions of highest importance, and we start carving away regions of the design until we end up with a square thumbnail, and we merge and blur the edges. This is very familiar to seam carving, to those of you who are aware of this concept. There are some kind of byproducts of the seam carving. As you can see, the white blur in the right-hand side. As I mentioned, it's not a polished product. This is just the very first iteration of this idea, just to show that importance alone can be used for this task. Here's some more examples. You can see that we're able to pull text and images from different parts of the design. We're able to compress bar graphs. We're able to pull text from different regions as well. I'm showing you a failure case in the right here where maybe we cut off some of the text. So there's a lot of easy fixes that can be put in place if, say, Adobe or someone else wants to make this into a product. But this is our research prototype. We wanted to show that this research prototype is nevertheless useful. And the way we did this is we wanted to simulate this exact search task. Like if you had a giant database of visualizations and you needed to find a particular one, could you do it more efficiently using our thumbnails? And so we designed a task that we crowdsourced. So we, again, put on Amazon's Mechanical Turk. Participants would see a whole list of these thumbnails. There would be a scroll bar on the right. And they would be asked to find a visualization matching a particular target phrase, like, say, worker satisfaction in the workforce. And we monitored how long it took them, how many clicks it took them to find the correct visualization. We did this using our thumbnails and also using the original visualizations resized to thumbnail size. Now, they were able to do this much more efficiently when we gave them our smart thumbnails. And what this is telling us is that Importance was able to pull the content that does help people retrieve the content they're looking for more efficiently. So it is able to pull to the forefront and enlarge the key regions that people would want to look at. Okay, and then the final application that really makes use of the fact that this whole system has a neural network in the back end is this interactive graphic design tool. Now, at test time, neural networks can be run at essentially real time, which means they could be added in and run on the go. And this is what we see here. So as designers move around elements, we can show them how the predicted importance or people's predicted attention on the design changes over time. Now, we're currently expanding this work, and maybe you have a lot of ideas too, but there's a big umbrella of research that's now extending from this kind of work. And in general, I think that this umbrella of research can be summarized very nicely by this Wired quote, that we're on the verge of another revolution as artificial intelligence and machine learning turn the graphic design field on its head again. And they, again, refers to the first revolution that went from print to digital. And now we're adding AI and creativity with AI back into the digital to now venture into completely novel spaces and see if we can make creative AI machines. And as you can imagine, Adobe is very interested in this direction, as am I. So that's how I ended up where I am. But let this serve as a recruiting call, not to Adobe, but towards the enterprise of interdisciplinary research. So for the students out there, not to be scared to open the doors and go in places where maybe there aren't tools yet available, because there's a lot of really interesting questions and a lot of really ripe fruit for the picking. So I'll end on that note, and I'll take any questions. Thank you.
So I was interested in the memorability of the graphics, and it seems to me that there may be a contradiction between memorability and understandability. So I'm thinking about like Edward Tufte's design principles. He has an example of how the engineers that were looking at the Space Shuttle Challenger presented this graphic that had little pictures of rockets, and everybody liked the pictures of rockets, but nobody noticed the pattern of lower temperature leading to failure. So have you looked at that sort of understandability of the data as opposed to remembering the graphics?
Yes, so it's not fully a contradiction, it's a difference in audience. So Tufte speaks to the experts more. So if you want to communicate something to an expert, how would you do it? You do it by minimizing noise. So you really want to put signal up front. Now, the audience that I have in mind, and we have in mind with our memorability studies, is really the mass public. And we're really envisioning the mass public that isn't even going to look carefully at it, but it's going to glance over, maybe has 10 seconds of time to look at it. And there we care about capturing the attention of that general public and having them take away something from it. Now, if they take more time to look at it, they will start to see the trends. But one key thing there is, of course, as we're adding visuals, we're also we're adding more signal. You could call it more noise, but really we're just duplicating our signal again and again. And it turns out that if you replicate your signal in different ways, using text, using visuals, you'll just capture more of the population.
So there was an example you had of the Microsoft tool that showed bottles. And the bottles, as the necks of the bottles got narrow, they were no longer bar graphs. They were sort of showing volume. And that's the kind of thing Tufty talks about, that that's actually misleading the viewer about which one is bigger or how much bigger. So even if you're doing it for a mass audience, it seems like you need to think about, are you conveying the right information or misleading information?
Right, and that's correct. So what we looked at was this kind of initial entry point into what kinds of things are memorable, but specifically whether certain visual encodings are misleading or not misleading, that does need, that warrants more investigation. So we're not saying that people should now go out there and put bottles and dinosaurs in all their visualizations. This does require more research into what kind of encodings do help with your data as opposed to hurt. And that's something that more of the community is starting to look at. So yeah, I mean, that's a very, very good point, yeah.
Are you looking at different cultural situations? Do we see things differently depending upon where we come from?
So we did not separate our population by location, which we could do on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, to see if people from one place of the world find one set of images more memorable than another. But the kind of hypothesis we're going on is people are exposed to similar images on the web in terms of the image search they do in the social networks. So they're going to have a very similar context, at least base context of images to begin with. And that's what we're trying to model here, that given this general context of images that you might be exposed to on the web, here's what would be memorable. But yes, we also showed that if the context changes a little bit, memory changes as well. So that's a question that we haven't answered yet. And also how, it goes back to the first question, how memory changes for the specialist, because a specialist has different context. So if you're constantly working in amusement parks, maybe things are going to look a little different to you. So we haven't gone that fine grain yet.
Oh, I have a question. When you were talking about memory from natural images, the eye seemed to go to specific details or unique areas, but with the graphic images, they went to the middle. They had more memory capability. I was wondering why that is for natural versus graphic.
Oh, well, so going to the middle happens for all images at the very beginning. So people tend to anchor on the middle. They're kind of getting a general scope before they start exploring. Some of the maps I showed you for the visualizations and graphic designs, if they were collected with the mouse methodology, people are actually clicking somewhere. So we eliminate that middle section. But if we were capturing their eye movements on those images, that middle would come out as well. One of the reasons you wouldn't see it also is as we extend the duration of time people have to look at the images, the other places they look and what they choose to read overwhelms that middle signal. But that middle signal exists very strongly in natural images that are shown for 1 or 2 seconds because people are trying to get the general gist of the image. And that's actually been a big problem in computational modeling of attention because people have wondered, should we build this into our models or not? It's a strange kind of bias humans have. Is this even interesting to build in? And that's caused big debates. But yes, it's fun that you've noticed it.
So first of all, I found your entire presentation extremely cool. And I guess the obvious applications are in content creation. My question is this: what is your vision for how Adobe or any company can leverage your findings to create a tool? Is it that users will give in particular inputs of what the theme and the rough style they want to go by, or the users will make a design and then use the tool to kind of get a metric for how memorable their design is, or a combination of both those techniques? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, all of the ideas you mentioned are very valid. We've talked to designers at Adobe in particular, and they said, well, actually at Adobe and Facebook, I talked to designers, and they said, okay, cool. What you show me, what people find important, I knew that. You don't need to visualize it for me. And I said, well, okay, what do you want me to visualize for you so that you're interested by it? And they're like, oh, no, if you visualized anything else, I just wouldn't believe you. So, what you did is good. But just giving the feedback is not enough. So the way I visualize using these tools in the future is for synthesis, and it's for a novice user. So given that designers know the design principles, can we build them in automatically in a way that, say a novice user says, okay, well, I want to create a poster. I want it to have all of this information. Go. Lay it out for me in a way that's going to direct people's attention naturally, that they're going to spend the most time on the elements that are most important to me. So maybe you provide a list of elements and how important they are to your message. Like, here's what I want people to take away in the first second of viewing. Here's what I want people to take away if they're actually interested in what I have to advertise in my event, for instance. Here's the details I want only the people who are interested to see. So how can you optimize that design for me? So that kind of design optimization synthesis could be useful to novice users and could make use of some of this information. But yeah, this is a little bit further away. This is going to require a bit more innovation and thinking. The simplest use case is a score metric that can be used right off the bat for filtering. So if we want to suggest images for people to put on their websites, icons to put in their presentations, can we help them find the most effective visual content to do so to grab an audience? Yeah.
Did you use your tools on your own presentation?
I did. So actually in previous, well, not quite on this one. I used the insights that I've learned for the presentation. I've made this slide pop out. It's distinct because I want this kind of image in your head. I've used the fact that if you have memorable titles that are the message of your visualization, people tend to remember the visualization better. So if I put if my titles were the message of what I wanted you to take away, I think that you would have taken away the message better. Redundancy helps, and it's a very visual presentation, so I've used those aspects. Actually, for my thesis defense, because I thought someone would ask that, I ran my attention prediction on my first slide, and then later I redesigned it to show something without noise and more effective. So I can do this for every presentation from now on, but if I can expect these questions to keep coming up.
You can
I can eye track you.
I'm curious, how much studying was done on the differences between memorability through information versus abstraction? So let's say you have a bridge, and you know for sure that it's a bridge and you register it as a bridge, as opposed to you have a bridge and you register it because it's a big red rectangle in the middle of the screen. Like, how much studying was done that fits the memorability of those two different approaches?
I don't quite know how to answer your question other than maybe I don't fully understand it.
Well, you could remember an image because it conveys the vocabulary of itself really.
Oh, so you abstract away the concept. You don't forget. You forget the details, but you know that you've seen a bridge, for instance.
Something could be memorable because it gives you information very clearly and you know exactly what it's telling you, or something could be memorable because it gives you a set of shapes that you just respond to on a very basic aesthetic level really easily. And I'm curious, like both of those I could see as being very powerful memory tools, right? Oh, I remember this image, it's really bright red on top of really bright blue, as opposed to, oh, I remember this image, it's a girl eating an apple. And she's really eating that apple, right? So
Yeah, so we haven't broken it up like that, and there is a lot of confounding factors there as well. So if you think about graphic designs or visualizations, there's another thing that comes into play. Are you interested in the topic? Are you remembering that because the topic is relevant or because the way it's conveyed is effective? It's another version of what you say. We can't disentangle it at this point. One thing we did try was for all the images in our natural image collection, we ran them through a network that predicted the category. And we did notice that, say, if the network was more confident that that image comes from that category, that it wouldn't collapse in memory with other categories, so it would be more memorable. But there's a fine line that we don't quite get, which is, can you make people remember that it's of that exact category, but different from all the instances in that category? That we don't quite get. And your question is kind of a deeper one. Why exactly people remember? Is it the content? Is it the elements? Is it the message? We don't quite know yet. But we do get some hints that if your, say, visual content and your message correspond together closely, that you can use the visuals to pull out the message, which is something I've said before. But you could easily make something memorable without making it informative. We can weed those examples out by asking people questions later on. Maybe one more question, because I think it's time. No? We have time?
Hang around for another hour.
Okay. Well, if anyone needs to go, it's 2:30, you can go, and then I can keep answering questions for as long as you need me to. Yeah?
So I was thinking about the example that you had with Obama in making the red and blue bars. So I'm a cancer researcher, and let's say that I had some bar plot that had 50 categories, right? If I only show 2, okay, so the question is more on the topic of like information content in a graphic that you need to show. So in the case that you only have 2 categories, fine, or the one that you had with the flags that I think had like 5, that's still like a reasonable number. But if I had like 50 categories that I just have to show, and if I don't show, then somebody looking at that graphic might accuse me of cherry-picking results. Like, did you think about those in any of the studies?
So how to expand the amount of data you're seeing and still make people be able to take it all in? Well, okay, so there's a few aspects to that. Memorable might not be the right question for a complex data set that you want to show to specialists. It goes back to the first question where, is this a message you want the general public to take away, or is this a message you want the specialist to take away? And if it's the specialist, then it's not so much a question of memorability, it's a question about maybe clarity of that large data set. Now, if you wanted to display something of that to the general public, I mean, you would subsample the data because you know that you're not going to have their attention for long. So you would have to pick something to show them, probably something that supports some message. To a scientific audience that's cherry picking, and for someone who wants to look at the full data set, they need it. To a public, you'd still need to reduce it down.
So did you look into that question of clarity?
No, not specifically. No. But it does. So there's a question, it goes back to the first point, but I just want to repeat it. There's a question of clarity because there is no noise present, and that's why it's clear, because only the message is repeated once, like here's the pure data, and it's clear because that's the only message there. There's also clarity that comes from repeating the message multiple times, but it's a different kind of clarity. You're now adding more elements to your design. It's now kind of noisier, but it's meant to capture more audiences. Maybe someone understands the message better if it's put in text, so add an informative caption. Maybe someone's better because they see it visually, so add an informative visual piece of content. Add little icons. So it's different levels of clarity. So we have some intuitions, but we didn't study this closely.
Can I ask a
Yeah. You go ahead.
I think we should actually stop.
Yeah.
People could ask questions.
Okay. Well, I'm here until 3, so. Yeah.